Vagrant Story is a very interesting game. Yeah, that is a phrase I used a lot during my actual Let's Play of it, but it's a thought that never really left me throughout it. Developed by SQUARESOFT before the Square Enix merger, at the end of the PlayStation 1's lifecycle, Vagrant Story is an experimental JRPG that takes on a mixture of action elements to complement new takes on the classic JRPG mechanics. The title, upon its initial release at the turn of the millennia, was met with extremely high praise for its story, in-depth gameplay system, and presentation-pushing initiatives for the day. It's been 16 years since its initial release, and many things and standards have changed though. It has been released for the PS3 and portable systems as a PS1 classic since then. So, can this game hold up even with that age? Was it ever really worthy of the praise in the first place? I suppose now is as good a time as any to find out. Shall we? You know, Vagrant Story would actually make for a really interesting case study. I'm not exactly an academic in video games, but I can imagine a grad student in this field researching the history of game mechanics and stumbling upon this old, brittle gem. Let's just say it's unique, especially for its time. Fundamentally, it's an action JRPG. Think series like Kingdom Hearts, the Tales series, or, to some, the Souls series. Those are some of the action JRPGs people tend to fall back on when they try to picture them. Now, Vagrant Story, it's a bit different. It's much more experimental, and it was made back in the PS1 era, where 3D action JRPGs were, at their absolute strongest point, experimental stages. Now, if I was to describe Vagrant Story, I would say it's sort of analogous to a real-time combination of a creature racing JRPG like Pokemon and a rhythm game, think Guitar Hero or something else of that sort. Really, the game has about two mechanics that really tend to define the entire experience. These are the weapon system and the chain system. The weapon system is essentially a replacement for more traditional leveling. Each weapon you hold has its own set of stats and affinities in elements, striking types, beast types. Defensively, every combatant in the game also has some sort of combination of these affinities as well. The matchup between weapon affinities and strength with the enemy will be the defining factor of each conflict in every single attack. Weapons grow in affinity or base strength by either grinding enemies of that type or by upgrading their components. The former is essentially a way of quantifying the player's improvement of the actual main character's skill with a certain weapon against certain enemy types. Now, the chain system I mentioned is also a big part of the action JRPG interactions. Each time you open up the attack options, you have the choice to attack different limbs. You even have percent chances to land hits in the same sort of fashion as VATs in modern Fallout games. This is where the affinity interactions start being applicable. Those determine your chance to hit, but once the actual initial hit is done, you can choose to follow up the attack. These are chains, and they come in many forms. The ability to continue these follow-up attacks appear infinite, but they become more and more precise as you continue. This is the more rhythm game I spoke of. Chaining isn't always the best idea though, since you accumulate risk. Risk is a metric that decreases your accuracy in exchange for harder hits on both sides of the fight. Hell, at times, this could be the difference between a boss being able to one-shot you or not, so it's important to manage this carefully. These mechanics aren't everything there is to the game, of course. There is magic, occasional minor stat boosts to the player's base stats, progression by unlocking new chains, the defensive side of what's already being discussed, and all the different location and timing considerations in battles. Between everything, it really does do a good job of making a logical, realistic gamification of what the player does in the story. There's a ton of different types of tactics a person could employ, too. Though part of the problem is that you tend not to. What you do tends to be entirely dependent on how prepared you are. Heavily prepared players that know all the right equipment for an encounter most likely not have much difficulty with it. It can make them feel OP, even. Most battles are a matter of buffing yourself in the right way, taking out a weapon you have prepared, and hacking away until they're dead. Those without the prior knowledge to build up an arsenal good against a specific boss will find themselves in a bit more of a pickle. You can rely on chains to stay alive and damage them to some extent, but these battles are repetitive, drag on for long periods of time, and tend to force you to rely a bit too heavily on luck. The middle ground offers some more interesting curveballs, but it's a hard area to reach for that interaction. Because chances are, if you know the game well enough to be prepared really at all, chances are you'll end up overprepared. And if you don't have this knowledge, you'll just end up underprepared because you don't know better. Overall, even if you ignore the massive learning curve that the game requires, the dog shit tutorials or really a game manual that the game provides, and the awful user interface for everything, The gameplay itself is pretty borderline whether it can be qualified as good or not. Sort of depends on the person. The design of the conflicts work against the user with large punishments if you're not prepared correctly. It's definitely not forgiving, and for many that can take away from the guess and check knowledge design it really works towards. It can simply find itself so contradictory at times that it's hard to like, despite having such high potential. Welcome to the realm of Valendia, where the kingdom holds a city called Leamonde. The city, left abandoned by the living through a series of destructive earthquakes, holds secrets beyond the public's knowledge. This is a world of magic, with a power that be swayed heavily by that influence. Leamonde, as empty as it is, finds itself as the stage of this game in this world as a religious zealot turned terrorist flees from the Duke's burning mansion to this city. You take on the role of Ashley Riot, a risk breaker. A risk breaker in this world is essentially the equivalent of an elite spy. Essentially, you're like a fantasy world's James Bond. Tasked with tracking down the zealot called Sydney, you encounter him at the burning mansion before following him to the decrepit city. From there, you keep on the tail of Sydney while dealing with new interferences from the other factions with their slice of the pie on the line. The plot itself is quite interesting with its own twists and turns throughout the cityscape. It's also notable that this game, while despite the name, is actually a spin-off of Final Fantasy Tactics. I'm not sure if this was retconned in later or if it was the initial intention, but either way, it is supposed to be taking place in the same world of Final Fantasy Tactics, and I believe also Final Fantasy XII. Mind you, you don't need to know anything about it to understand the story, but it does take place in the same basic setting. There is a little bit of an attempt to familiarize the players with details contextualizing the entire story in the world, but it's not extensive, and it probably could have been expanded upon. Though the reason it really doesn't matter is that the plot of the game is largely self-contained. While some elements spread out to the nature of the world, most of them are actually personal. This is a mystery that intertwines the personal stories of everyone involved, their motivations, their fears, regrets. This is a story of those and how everyone has their own secrets to keep. Mind you, the plot itself isn't the most extensive of things. It, like noted before, is following Ashley as he tracks down Sydney. This follow-through is a constant. While many instances do offer a reprieve for the mysteries to tease and intertwine themselves, the mysteries end up still being very personally and character-driven. It works actually very well as a method of pushing the player forward, and it definitely likes its rule of cool. While it's not nearly over the top in any way or form, there's a certain dramatic tension built from everything seen that allows the cinematography to shine and engross. This is especially true in the ending, where the struggles come to a head. With this, the ending is no different. It's actually really satisfying. Despite all my gripes I've had with the game, from everything in all the different sections, I really would like to see a sequel to this with modern gameplay design and whatnot, because the ending of the story really leaves it open to that possibility, and it seems like a very good setup for another story. Admittedly, I'm not really all that familiar with the terminology here. Are they pixels? No. Voxels? I don't think so. Whatever they are called, you can see the polygons, maybe it's polygons, with your own eyes. This was a PS1 game, and it's really hard to deny it when looking at the graphics. They're definitely very aged. You can see it in the character models, you can especially see it in the environment. While the city the story takes place in and focuses on is well crafted and nice, inviting flair to it, many of the areas are basically caves, mines, and many other pretty uninteresting locales of very simple geometry and textures. For a game of its short size, it's actually surprising to see examples of copy and pasted rooms. It's unfortunate because the general art style actually holds up pretty well. The soundtrack doesn't fare a ton better. It sets off all sorts of alarms for generic fantasy. Usually it's at least decent and fitting with what it needs to be, but most of the time I found myself indifferent to the presence of music in the first place. It rarely evoked the necessary feelings to an extent that I really cared, and that sort of speaks heavily on the soundtrack. What's even worse is the UI. The user interface can be described in one word: atrocious. Visually, it's simple and stuffs mountains of information onto the screen for only those well-versed in the mechanics to comprehend. Actually makes me think that some of the more modern practices, like slowly opening parts of more complex menus, may have been driven from feedback on menus like this. In a sense, I can imagine the menu increasing the difficulty curve considerably because it does not explain things well and you gotta figure it out from the menus. Okay, I'm done ragging on it. Why? Because I actually do think Vagrant Story is quite smart in its presentation, bar the UI elements. Though it does stand as one of the few games of the PS1 era to invest in truly three-dimensional cinematic storytelling. For a PS1 game, it's actually sort of shocking to see how well directed the storytelling can be. Despite the graphics, little emotions and little moments ooze personality in both the character, the world, and the scenes itself. Vagrant Story is definitely a game well ahead of its time in this respect, and it might be the most successful attempt to do just that at the time. Hey, I heard you wanted to attack, let's wait a while. Want to just run through a room? Well, good for you, because I heard that enemy that responded decided to use several spells before you get the chance to leave. Oh, and the game doesn't let you skip the animation since they're all the way across the room. No, it won't. It's just, this game is so fucking slow. The UI doesn't help either. The pure complexity of the mechanics doesn't help either, but the UI lacks any semblance of intuitiveness. It's just a bunch of typical PS1 menus with more information than it knows what to do with. And then you have that slowness, which is present in most parts. Animations rarely have a snappy feel to them. Spells always feel the need to make you read everything before they even start, so it's always a matter of waiting a while for it to end. The menus have just enough delay to get on your nerves. Trying to do anything in the menus tends to be about 3 times as long as you actually want to spend doing it. It's a problem rampant throughout. There's quick menus for some abilities, but even these are closer to what the menu should have been like to begin with. In a sense, it actually works against the action aspect molded into the system. It's not like it's a Kingdom Hearts-styled action game, but at the same time, it's a competing presence between the static gameplay structure JRPGs typically give and the dynamic feel action titles have, and the balance just is not there. Mind you, despite all this, I still enjoyed the game most of the time. There were certainly times that just made me hate myself, and others it was actually quite satisfying. There are a lot of good ideas here that just made me wish they were more competently done with more modern ideas. You can clearly see some of the classic design mentalities not meshing with the ideas too. Outside of the UI issues already discussed, you have the issues like save points being a thing for a game that emphasizes multiple tries at bosses. You have a progression style that's the biggest component involves grinding off repetitive encounters in specific ways. The action JRPG hybrid here isn't the most compelling for grinding too. There are some workarounds, but boy will they make you work for it. And in general, the idea of large punishments for not knowing a difficult to learn game is very present here, and it serves as a detriment for me. I like a lot about what the game has to offer, but there are so many moments that just makes me think that it wants me to hate it. And that's the most conflicting part here. Vagrant Story is a deeply, deeply flawed game, and I can't honestly say I've ever had such mixed feelings over a game before. It wears its flaws and successes on its sleeve with pride, and then proceeds to dare you into loving or hating it. It's certainly a game that was well ahead of its time, and ended up letting technologies and design mentalities of its time constrain ideas to not reaching their potential. I am honestly not sure if I like it or dislike it, though I would probably lean more towards liking it. It's sort of the game that, if I wasn't LPing it, I probably never would have bothered going through it to the end. And while I certainly enjoyed it more as I pushed through with learning the different mechanics and so, it never really got to a point that I could look back and say it was all worth it. I did, however, go past the point of me saying it wasn't worth it, and this has me in that sort of limbo between the two opinions. If I were to choose, I'd say it's more of a recommended game experience over others. Just be very wary of where it goes wrong if you decide to try it. And the typically cheap entry price for this on PS3 and Vita really doesn't hurt because it's like $6 and it probably would be worth the risk of at least trying it. Though as mixed as I am on the game itself, I really do see a ton of potential here. With modern technology and design mentalities, I'd love to delve back in this world again in a sequel. I just don't see that happening, nor does anyone else it seems. Maybe one day. One day. Okay, recommendation time. Final Fantasy Tactics. Set in the same world, and I mean, if you like the story part of it, maybe you like Final Fantasy Tactics. I've never played it, I just know it's like that, and I'm just gonna throw it out there as a thing that you might enjoy if you like Vagrant Story. The other one, more on the gameplay side, Souls, the Souls series. Why? I don't think they're remotely nearly the same game, but it has the same sort of set of ideas, where it's very much a system that's made for you to perfect it, for you to learn it, and really that's the point of the game, where it's not about trying to make a good progression of figuring stuff out. It's more about trying to learn the actual games. Mind you, I haven't played the Soul series, so I may have no idea what I'm talking about, but this is always the impression I've got from the Soul series, and it seems to give me the same impression as the Vagrant Story gave me when I was playing it. So you might enjoy it if you enjoyed that, and so forth, and so what, etc. Words. I have more words to say, I'm sure. Speaking of words, I am super duper sorry that this came out so late. I have good reasons why I've been not putting this out, and it's probably the latest I've ever had a post-LP review. Yeah, I also have bad reasons. Some of the good reasons are like I was just busy in a semester, blah blah blah. I had like 4 games running. I still have 4 games running. I had other things that I had to record and script and stuff that had involved more work during that time frame. And the bad reasons are is that there was actually a bit of time that I could have been working on it over the past month or so. And I decided not to because I was tired and I didn't feel like it. And yeah, I'm sorry that I sometimes that happens. Sometimes this is a hobby for me, and I prefer to. It's just low priority, especially, and that is not a good reason. I understand it's not a good reason. It's not a good reason to me, and I'm sort of sad that I ended up doing that. Every time I did it, I sort of hit myself, but I did it, and I'm gonna apologize for it. Simple as that. Other than that, I don't really have much else to say. The next review I'm going to be working on is for Pokemon. Man, I've put that off for a while too. Hopefully I can get that one with a bit of a quick turnaround. I don't know, I need to start writing it. Otherwise, I'll see you all next time. Drive safely.